This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 13. Welcome to the 13th episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source of information about the Fertility Awareness method and all things fertility. Please stop by the blog and leave a comment if you enjoy today's show. You'll find the show notes for today's episode and all the podcast episodes at fertilityfriday.com/podcast. You can find me on Twitter at FertileFriday also, so please tweet me if you enjoyed today's show. And in today's episode, I'm very excited to be talking with Justina Thompson. Justina is a certified fertility awareness educator and the founder of redcoralfertility.com. As an educator, she connects women with a deeper knowledge about their bodies and teaches women how to use the fertility awareness method for birth control, to optimize the chances of conception, as well as to improve menstrual cycle health overall. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Justina.
Hi, thanks, Lisa. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks so much for being here. And so I gave you a bit of an intro, but I'd love to hear about what brought you into the field of fertility awareness and how you discovered the method.
That is a great question. I actually have a pretty serendipitous story myself. So I was raised with conventional healthcare, and by the time I was a teenager, I was put on the patch for acne, and we were just prescribed the patch for acne without much information from the dermatologist and without us asking many questions. We were just living in an area where you don't really question the doctors. The doctors are there to help you and give you information. And so I was on the patch as young as, I believe, 14 and 15 for acne. And eventually got off of that and went on to college and just learned that by the time I needed to look into long-term birth control options with my boyfriend, who became my husband, he had some other input. And the reason that he wanted to keep me off of the birth control pill or the patch or the IUD is because he came from a background where he was raised in natural health care from the time that he was a baby, and his mom is a certified natural health professional, and so he said there must be something else, and I told him, no, there's not. The only option we have is the birth control pill. That's our only option. And it was his, peaceful and quiet nudging of, well, there must be something else out there, that kept me thinking. And in my health and sexuality class, of course, I wasn't told any options about natural birth control. I mean, we all know they go through the chapters, and it's just very conventional information. And I had a special research project in that class at the time about a culture in India. And the girls in this special tribe knew when to not have sex because they knew when they were menstruating and they knew when they were ovulating. And this is a culture that didn't have any technology that we have today, or any official schooling sex health classes. And the way that they knew this was by the moon. And that really caught my attention, really, really. So I looked more and more into researching this connection that women's cycle have with the moon. And there's a lot of information out there that just doesn't work in standard American life, as it would for a tribe that has, no electricity, no other light interference. And that took me, Lisa, to finding information about the fertility awareness method online.
What an amazing story.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, no. I was just going to say, I think it's so sweet that it ended up being your spouse who encouraged you not to be on hormonal birth control. I would imagine that a lot of women have the opposite experience. And right. So it's really nice that those gentle nudges kind of led you in this direction.
Yeah. In fact, it's funny that you admire that. He actually said, I will get a vasectomy before you go back on the birth control pill.
Wow. That's
Uh,
pretty that's pretty awesome actually.
yeah, and I knew his mom wouldn't be down with that, so we had to figure something out. But yeah, I started charting with the fertility awareness method through Katie Singer's book Garden of Fertility. And I read that you learned through Toni Weschler's book,
Yes.
which is also amazing. I didn't know about her book at the time. I learned through Katie's book. And with full skepticism, thinking there's absolutely no way this is going to tell me anything about my body. And after one charted cycle, of course, this was all just in the educational, experimental phase. I was not planning on using the method for birth control unless I felt fully confident about it. And within the first month, I realized, like, wow, this method, it's like really rocks my socks off. Like, I can see what my body's doing. And then there was that like lingering question, but can it be used as effective birth control? So I continued charting, and after 3 cycles charted, it was completely apparent to me that the effectiveness was all up to me and my consistency, because my body was giving me all the information I needed. So
Yeah, I feel like that's when you have that full chart or a few, and you see that it's cyclical, and you see that, I mean, it doesn't always look exactly like what it shows in the book, and every woman's experience is different. But once you can see that confirmed ovulation and how your fertility signs change after that, and you realize, like you said, that your body is telling us something, and every day you can tell where you are in your cycle, and it's not this woo-woo, like up there stuff. It's actual physical science. So I love that. And I love your story. And I can relate, because for me, it was very similar. I was pretty sold when I read Toni Weschler's book, but I still had that kind of seed of doubt. Like, is this really going to work? Like,
right.
can you really have unprotected sex on certain days and not get pregnant? And yeah, you can.
Yeah. It's so exciting. Such good news for women to know about their bodies.
Exactly the opposite as everything that we're taught when we're
Right.
learning about sex education, because you're never taught that there are any safe days.
Right.
And so I'd love to hear a little bit about then the transition from you learning the method and discovering it for yourself, and then how you kind of decided to transition into doing this as a career.
Sure. That's a great question. Um, I Once I started implementing the fertility awareness method as my primary birth control, I had some questions and doubts along the way. I was living in a Bible Belt town in Texas, and there were no educators about the fertility awareness method or even natural family planning through the Catholic Church. There were no educators in my city.
Wow.
So if I wanted to consult with an educator, I would have had to drive, 300 miles either west or southeast to Dallas or Austin, Texas, to meet with one of these. And the town I was in, it's a small city, Abilene, Texas, not very small, but there still just was that blank, like a hole for this type of information there. And I continued using the method through my first year of marriage without having consulted with an educator. So my body kind of started doing different things my first year of marriage than it was doing before. I think switching to an active sex life can cause some differences in a woman's charting than before she hits that phase of life. And so I had lots of questions, and I had even bigger doubts about how I was using the method. So I would say my first year of marriage, I may have only used the method for birth control for like maybe 4 months out of 12 months. I was continuing to chart diligently, but I relied on condoms, on barrier methods for most of that year, because I had such huge questions that I didn't have a person I could turn to and say, hi, like, can you look at my charts? Can you answer some of my questions? I want to make sure I'm doing this really well. All I knew was that there were some books out there with authors who were not reachable.
Yeah.
So after that first year, I decided to get on the internet again. I tried to search several times on the internet, and I just wasn't finding resources that you can find today. I saw one of your most recent blog posts, Lisa. It was like 22 websites about fertility awareness, and I think only one of those existed back at the time that I'm talking about, and it wasn't very helpful. So it's just great to see how things have changed today. But so I finally found an educator in Oregon, Sarah Naomi Bly of Grace of the Moon, and I signed up for her class, and I also signed up for her Fertility Awareness Teacher Educator program, because I knew no matter what else I wanted to do with my life, I wanted to share this information with other people so that women and men and adolescents know that it is a valid option. It is an effective option, so that when they do need to make a different decision in their life for birth control, maybe they're on the pill and that's not working out for them, or maybe they have other issues in their health history where they can't be on synthetic hormones like the pill and the IUD, then they just know that they're not screwed for life. They get to have a healthy sex life with an effective birth control that doesn't come with the side effects or the health risks.
Yeah, I think that's so important, because just like you said earlier, when your boyfriend, now husband, told you, about the birth control pill and the side effects, and he didn't want you to be on it, and your response was, that's the only thing that's going to work. That's what we're told. And all of the messages that we receive from the time we're children, they're so powerful, and they stick with us. And like you said, it's important for women to at least know that there's this option that is effective. And that's the most important part, that it is effective. And the studies that I often quote, there's a study on the Justice website, and I have all kinds of links to it on my website, that shows that it's 99.6% effective when used perfectly. And I think in some ways similar to you, when I first started using the fertility awareness method, I was charting every month, and I did use condoms during when I was first starting, pregnancy wasn't an option for me.
Right.
And so I would actually use a barrier method during kind of the pre-ovulatory phase. So I was kind of using it for longer in my cycle than I had to, I guess.
Right.
But until you gain that confidence, like you said, with the support of a teacher, or at least so that you can have someone look at your charts and you can gain that confidence, it's often a little bit hard to kind of trust the method. So I would trust it after the confirmed ovulation temperature type of thing.
Right, after you saw the double cross check.
Exactly.
Well, and that's a good point. I realized once I sat down with Sarah Bly and did a chart review with her that my questions were so small. Like, she answered them in a moment, and things clicked all over the place for me. And sitting in her class, I knew a lot of the information already from having studied the books, but just hearing things put a different way and in a different context and in real time, I think it just clicked with me. And so I would say I only had about 3 or 4 questions that were answered in that type of professional relationship with my mentor and with my teacher that just helped me really launch off and have a whole new relationship with my fertility awareness method charting, to the point where I gained full confidence. And so once I saw that might be, reoccurring for other women around the world, I wanted to be one of those teachers that someone could come to and say, I just have these 2 little questions, or here's my cervical fluid, here's a picture of it. And I always tell my clients, like, text me pictures of your cervical fluid, or text me videos of what it's looking like to you if you have any questions, because I don't want another day to go by in a new charter's life where they're doubting something that could be answered in just 3 seconds.
Hmm. I think that that's a really powerful statement that you're making too, because a lot of it is intuitive. I guess intuitive once you kind of learn and gain the confidence and answering those few simple questions that can really open up the whole world. Because it's often not. I mean, we kind of as you start charting, you get it. After a few
Right.
after a few cycles, you get it. But those few little questions can really prevent you from gaining the full confidence, as you mentioned. And so, I think that that's such a great point, because it's not to say that you needed someone to over explain over and over again everything that was happening, but you just had those few questions that once they were answered and once you could share those little questions with somebody, all of a sudden it started to make sense.
Absolutely.
And so many questions are around cervical fluid because there's so much variation there, and just
Hmm.
everyone's different, and especially there's different ways of checking. And so I guess to kind of backtrack a little bit, for anyone who's listening for the very first time or who may not be that familiar with the fertility awareness method, did you want to maybe give a kind of the basics? So kind of what it is and what we're talking about essentially.
Sure. So the fertility awareness method is 100% symptom-free form of birth control that is as effective as the pill, 99.6%, when used correctly. As you pointed out, Lisa, that is the most important part of the research, when it's used correctly. And it's a form of the symptothermal method, meaning that a woman is checking the symptom, which is her cervical fluid, against thermal, which is her waking body temperature, to know at the end of every day, am I fertile today, yes or no? And the reason that that matters is because a woman is not fertile every single day of her cycle. So a woman in her reproductive years is only fertile for about a third of her cycle. And the rest of the days, a woman is just scientifically not capable of getting pregnant. And we can track that one day at a time by by observing our cervical fluid throughout the day and writing that information down on a chart. And we can know that by checking our temperature every morning that we wake up before we do anything else, and putting that on the chart to see A, when the fertile wave starts for a woman, and B, when it finishes. So during that time, a couple can choose to either abstain from intercourse, or they can choose to rely on barrier methods during those fertile wave days that they are absolutely capable of getting pregnant. And so the fertility awareness method just opens up the doors for couples who are really fed up with the side effects of hormonal birth controls.
Okay, and maybe we could take a minute and talk about what some of the side effects are. I know that you mentioned that you were on the patch for a while, and then you were on the
Pill.
you were taking the pill for a while,
Yeah.
and so maybe you could talk about some of the effects that side effects you experienced, or even just some of the common side effects you see with your clients.
Sure, that's a great question. I when I was on the pill and the patch, it was the patch first, and then later on it was the pill. I didn't see side effects right away in myself. Having been put on that as a teenager and then again as a very young adult, it's it's not necessarily day and night changes that a woman might experience. Although I did have a friend in high school who was put on the same patch that I was on, and she ended up in the hospital with blood clots.
Oh, wow.
And it was pretty severe. And they said it's because of the patch, stop using the birth control patch. And so I looked at that situation and I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that happened. But, it's not going to happen to me. That was just her. And so even though the doctor said, it's your birth control patch, stop taking it, it in our society, in our culture, that didn't resonate. That doesn't roll over for the rest of the population on that product to think, oh, that can happen to me too. We
Mm-hmm.
think, okay, this is this is the one rare exception, this incident.
Yeah.
So I mean, I stayed on the patch probably a full year after that even happened. So yeah, some of the more severe symptoms would be hospitalization
Yeah.
from bigger things, but it doesn't happen like that with all women. So for me, it was a much more long-term sort of downturn in my life where one day I kind of just woke up and realized I hadn't been my vibrant and happy self for a really long time. And with that, some anxiety and depression snuck in and was taking over. I didn't have a libido anymore. Like, a young, vibrant woman should want to and be excited about experiencing all of her hormones and all of those ways. And just like that had disappeared for me. I was having migraines. And for me, I realized one day, okay, all of these things have sort of added up. What can I backtrack here? What is the point? And once I had the severe mood swings on the actual birth control pill, I knew it was time to just completely stop using hormonal contraceptives at that time. And so other side effects that a lot of women experience are weight gain. Some women are put on the pill to resolve acne, and it just covers up the symptom. It masks the symptom, and they find when they go off the birth control pill, they still have acne. Lots of long-term risks are associated with the hormonal contraception, such as like diseases and cancers. And so when we look at the symptoms, it depends on the woman, whether she's experiencing them right now, or if she's over time, they're like kind of adding up and stacking up against her, or maybe in 10 years, she'll have a higher risk of a disease or cancer. And just be like, where did this come from? I've been fine on the pill. And so there's a lot of different routes that the body can go, and it's just so individual for each person. But there is research out there that is pretty recent, and it shows that 50% of women who take the oral contraceptive pill discontinue it after 1 year due to symptoms and side effects that they experience. And that's a huge number.
And it's interesting because often if you go to your doctor and you say, I'm having certain symptoms, the solution is to go on a different pill or a different dosage with a different combination of the synthetic estrogen and progesterone hormones. And what I found interesting as well about when you described your own symptoms, I feel like in our culture, society, we're kind of the opinion that unless the side effects are really severe and obvious, that they don't exist. And I find what is kind of the scariest thing for me is that often when women talk about the side effects they've experienced from the pill, they're kind of subtle, like you said. They don't just slam you in the face. They kind of creep up. Right. And I think that the anxiety and depression and the mood swings, that's really hard to put your finger on, because that, if it happens within the 3-4 month period, and from my own experience, I mean, I was on the pill also from a young age, probably around the age of 15. And I probably took it for maybe 2 years, and then I went off it, and then I went back on for another 1.5 years. And I don't recall having, who knows? I probably wasn't as self-aware. So I don't recall having those emotional mood swings. I had other symptoms that I didn't like. I didn't like that my breasts were tender all the time. That kind of weirded me out. And I also didn't like that I knew it was masking I had menstrual cramps, and that's why I went on it. And I didn't like that it wasn't actually fixing it. So that's why I went off of it. But around that time, some friends of mine, they would talk about the emotional impact of it as well. So one of my good girlfriends, she had emotional ups and downs. Like she'd be happy one day, like upset the next, kind of anxious. And another friend of mine, she kind of lost her sex drive and was kind of like, what's the point of this? And so those are kind of less tangible symptoms.
Right. Yeah. And it's easy to fill in those shoes as a woman that the pill is the culprit. It's so much easier. And what I did in my own experience was feel like I just wasn't good enough anymore. I wasn't doing enough. I wasn't succeeding. I wasn't achieving. I wasn't taking, I don't know, good care of my self-esteem. I felt like I was doing something wrong as a person, as a woman, to myself. And I think exactly like you said, like it's hard to really pinpoint those symptoms of mood swings and anxiety and depression to medication.
And what I found from doing these interviews as well is that often you know that you're having these symptoms and you know that you're not kind of your best self and you're trying to figure out why, but the pill is the last thing that comes up. So you're looking at all these things, but the pill seems to be one of the very last things that you would attribute to these types of symptoms, because no one really talks about those symptoms being common from birth control pill use.
Exactly. I remember the 2 times I was working with a doctor to put me on the prescription birth control, and I just remember thinking I was so young and shy at the time, and I didn't ask doctors questions back then, and those doctors did not tell me anything about the birth control pill side effects. They just handed me my prescription script and sent me off to the pharmacy, and the pharmacist didn't tell me anything about the side effects, and I didn't read any of the paper material that comes with your prescription. I didn't read any of it. I mean, and that's why I'm such an advocate now to encourage women, do your research, really read over things, look into things from a lot of diverse sources, because the education that you need for your health really comes from what you're willing to look for. My doctors that I had at that time did not tell me anything about the pill. Nothing. They just gave it to me.
Yeah, I can kind of just totally relate to that, because when I went to the doctor when I was 15 or whatever, so I got my period, my menarche was around age 14. And my very first period was excruciatingly painful. So I've talked about that on the show before. But so I go to the doctor probably within 6 months to a year of my first period. And I basically said, my periods hurt. And before I even finished my sentence, he was already writing the prescription, right?
Oh my goodness.
I mean, maybe it wasn't that dramatic, but but that's what it was. I didn't have to say more than 2 sentences before he was writing the prescription for the pill. And I mean, that's what I was going for, because even as a kid, that's what you know that that's the solution. And, but on the flip side, I'm kind of a nerdy person. So even when I was younger, I did read. So the insert that comes with the little pill, I did read it. But the thing I would say is that we're so used to reading things about side effects that, just as you said earlier, when your actual friend was hospitalized for using the same thing you were using, we still have that disconnect. So even though I'm reading the stroke, because I always knew about that, because I would read the packet, the likelihood of getting a stroke or a blood clot or any of those types of things, but you never think it's going to apply to you. And I don't really remember reading anything about mood changes. Maybe it's there, but I mean, if you were to read on a packet, it might have mood changes. So what? You don't really think that that's serious.
It doesn't stand out as much as, you might have a blood clot.
Yeah. And even that, you're like, that's not going to happen to me.
Yeah. So
yeah, no, that's really great. I'm glad we talked a little bit about that, because I think that obviously all women are different. And so by no means does this conversation mean that we're saying that no one should ever take the pill, because there are periods of people's lives where different choices make sense, right? So I don't think that's the point of this, but it's more just someone needs to have the conversation about some of the real impacts of the pill. And also it's important I feel that it's always important for people to know all of their options. And as we talked about earlier, to know that the fertility awareness method is actually a viable, very reliable, it's as effective of an option as the pill. So it's not going to be for everybody, but it should be part of it. Like you said, when you had your class and they talked about all the methods, this should be one of them.
Right. Yeah.
And so kind of going back to the method, we talked about what the fertility awareness method is and what it's based on. And I think that, so for women who are trying to do their own research and they look online and the fertility awareness method, usually the information online would say 75% effective at the very bottom of the page where it says don't use it, basically, because it doesn't work. And often one of the things about the fertility awareness method is that it won't work if you have quote unquote irregular cycles. So for some reason, the fertility awareness method is still very much entangled with the rhythm method concept that you need to have 28-day cycles every month or it won't work. So maybe you could talk a little bit about why the fertility awareness method does work, even if your cycles fluctuate.
Sure. And just to note, like on the websites that we come across that lists all the effectiveness rates of contraception, natural and hormonal, they will lump fertility awareness method, which is what we've been talking about today, into the umbrella of fertility awareness based methods, which, like you said, absolutely includes the rhythm method, which everyone knows the rhythm method is ineffective. You could say it's 50% effective, which sounds completely ineffective to me. It gets lumped into this category of a method where a woman or a couple are charting signs and writing something on paper or maybe somehow keeping track of something. Yet when you look at every single method that is in the fertility awareness based method umbrella, that's under that, they are so different, and their effectiveness rates do vary quite a bit. So talking about what we're talking about today, let's put the rhythm method to bed. We know that's completely ineffective for couples. We're talking about the symptothermal method of fertility awareness, which is tracking cervical fluid and temperature to cross-check, essentially double-check one another to prove, yes, ovulation has happened, it has come and gone, and there is no chance of it happening again in this cycle. When we're talking about that method, the effectiveness is as effective as the pill. It's 99.4 to 99.6 effective when used correctly. And the reason that can be used for irregular cycles is because we're tracking on a day-by-day basis. We're not predicting what's gonna happen in 2 weeks. I'm probably gonna be ovulating in 2 weeks. When really in that cycle, maybe a woman didn't ovulate until 3 weeks later, if she was having a particularly stressed or phase of life where she's traveling a lot. So the way that FAM works with irregular cycles is similar to just knowing at the end of the day, am I fertile today, yes or no? Granted, what is an irregular cycle? Like, that question should be addressed. And that's one of the first things I teach in my workshops with students and clients is, here are 4 types of regular cycles. And so we're taught what an irregular cycle is. We're taught an irregular cycle is anything that's not 28, 29 days long. And that's actually not the case. There are variables of what's considered normal for women. And it turns out once women learn that, a lot of women realize they're not actually irregular, that their cycle does cycle with one of these variables of normal. And women who are, like, by definition having irregular and ovulatory cycles can still track and chart. It doesn't mean that they're going to have a ton of time in their cycle to have an infertile period, but it does mean that they'll know at the end of every day if that night is a time where they can have unprotected intercourse or not, based on what their intention is, if they're trying to avoid pregnancy. And so it's really empowering, because the first thing that I think fertility awareness teaches a woman is what type of cycle she has. And more often than not, women learn that they're actually not irregular.
I think I remember that was one of the things that I think I took from Toni Weschler's book, that I think I took it a little bit far, because I had my cycles were quite long because I had a thyroid issue that was undiagnosed until I started charting. So my cycles were like 45 days. But so when I read the book, I was like, oh, everyone's unique. And my 45, like I'm going to own and reclaim my 45-day cycle. You know what I mean? So I think I
Right.
took it a little bit to the other end because there is a range of normal and
Yes,
healthy.
there is a range.
But within that range, variation is perfectly normal. And I think that's such an important message because it's almost like we're graded in a sense. It's almost like your period, if your period isn't exactly 28 days, then there's something wrong with you because the medical model just tells us that that's the only option. 28
Right.
days is all there is. And if it's not 28 days, like you said, we're irregular and that's it.
Yeah. It gets really confusing to women.
Well, so one of the things that I wanted to talk about with you today is how women can learn to chart their cycles when they're breastfeeding, so kind of postpartum. And I think maybe before we go into that a little bit, maybe we could give a bit of foundation and talk about what the difference is. It might be too much of a loaded question, but what the difference is between a fertile day and a day that is not fertile. So kind of just to get our feet wet and talk a little bit about that before we kind of dive into the breastfeeding and how we could chart when breastfeeding.
Okay. It is a loaded question, but to be a little bit vague, that's definitely something that every woman learns when she takes a fertility awareness class or she reads a book and then follows up with an educator who can do like a private chart review with her and make sure that she is understanding that question very well. In a woman's cycle, after her period ends, she once she starts spotting, she starts checking her cervical fluid throughout the day, several times a day. And a woman who has read a book and taken a class or workshop with a professional educator learns when her sort of point of change happens, where she goes from seeing absolutely no cervical fluid to seeing the appearance of cervical fluid. And that is when cervical fluid is present, the most conservative practice for this symptothermal method is to consider that the beginning of a woman's fertile wave. And there's so much more.
Yes.
I could teach 2 hours on that question.
Yes.
But a woman is infertile in her cycle, officially infertile, after both her temperature and her cervical fluid have proven that, have followed the rules and have proven that she is infertile. And there are some infertile days there and the early infertile dry days as well. Again, this might sound a little technical to those of you listening who haven't been learning about cervical fluid up to this point, but it's broken down very well in any class that you'll take with any fertility awareness educator or Justice HealthWorks educator. So you're able to know based on reading your signs of fertility that day.
Okay, that's a great answer to that question because it is a loaded question. And when we used to do the monthly charting sessions, we would go through all of that over like a 9-month period and do like a monthly 2-hour session. So,
Yes.
so it's not, there's more to it than that, but at least there's that basic understanding of how it works. And the reason I wanted to ask the breastfeeding question is because I feel like it's, again, when you kind of go back to the popular discourse or common discourse around the fertility awareness method, there's often that idea that it's not effective during the postpartum period. I think it's one of those special charting considerations where if you really want to chart your cycles during the postpartum period, I think that situation especially, it would be best to work with an educator,
Yes.
especially if it's new to you, because it's a different type of charting. Because
Right.
when you're kind of going through your regular cycles and you're not pregnant, well, you haven't just had a baby and you're not breastfeeding, there is a cyclical nature. So you kind of know what's going to happen. You don't know when it's going to happen, but you know what you're looking for. Whereas when you're charting postpartum, it's not like that because you don't know when your fertility is going to return.
Exactly.
So, maybe you could talk a little bit about how it's different, just to kind of give an idea of why it's possible that it's effective as well when postpartum breastfeeding.
Sure. I love talking about fertility awareness and breastfeeding because there are so many myths around it. One myth is that you can't get pregnant when you're breastfeeding. That's a huge myth. You actually can get pregnant when you're breastfeeding. There's another myth as well that women postpartum who are breastfeeding need to go on a birth control pill or get an IUD or go on a patch. And so that's another myth that we're told by our doctors, that you have to do this to prevent pregnancy. You're not ready to have another baby right now. So, the OBGYN is going to do everything they can to make sure that you are not going to accidentally get pregnant again. And I think that's great that the OBGYN is giving that information to their postpartum client and saying, you're at risk for getting pregnant. What is your birth control? What are you going to figure out for yourself? I think that's really important. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I think all women need to just understand that they have options, that they don't have to go on a birth control pill while they're breastfeeding. And that if they do go on a birth control pill while they're breastfeeding, just to research the effects that can have on them and their baby. Mm-hmm. And so it is a sensitive subject because now it's not just involving a woman's body, it's also involving her breastfeeding baby. And so the OBGYNs, in my experience that I hear about, and I've sat there and I've heard the information myself when I've gone with friends to their postpartum appointments, will recommend like a low progesterone pill, mm-hmm. right? It doesn't have the estrogen, so it's not going to affect your breastfeeding baby. So there's so much research that a woman can do to learn about that statement, mm-hmm. and that there are ways that the birth control pill affects, and then a woman having that education to decide if that's important to her or not, like what her priority is. Like there are lots of women who choose to use a birth control pill while they're breastfeeding for very valid reasons. And so I just encourage women that before they make the decision that they know all the sides, mm-hmm. So that they feel like they're making a really informed decision. That said, fertility awareness for women who are breastfeeding is a lot easier if they have been charting their cycles in the past. Mm-hmm. So every now and then I work with women who have never charted their cycles before, mm-hmm. have given birth, are currently breastfeeding, and are ready to learn the fertility awareness method. Definitely in those cases, those women need to be working one-on-one with fertility awareness educators so that they're getting that like coaching every couple of weeks of looking at what's going on, what they're seeing, and getting really tuned in to helping them understand things as they're going along. And then women who have been charting, as you pointed out, Lisa, in the past, postpartum, their body's doing a lot of different things in a lot of different ways. And so the fertility awareness method actually has built-in rules for that circumstance where women are breastfeeding. And at that point, we rely on those rules instead of the 4 typical FAM rules, which is how I break it down in my workshops as the 4 FAM rules, which is actually more than 4, but there's 4 basic ones, and then there's some stipulations and other details to each one. But mm-hmm. When a woman has given birth, her fertility might return with as soon as a week, or it might return in a year. Mm-hmm. And that's how every woman is different, is she can't predict when that fertility is going to return. But something that she can start doing about 2 to 3 weeks postpartum is checking her cervical fluid at least once or twice a day, which can be a big commitment for a breastfeeding mom, like with mm-hmm. a newborn baby. When a woman sees that cervical fluid return, that is the first sign that her body is already starting to gear up to go on the long journey of returning to fertility.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've worked with clients who don't see that cervical fluid return for like 9 months, 13 months. And so they have a really awesome, they're checking their cervical fluid on a regular basis. They have a huge cushion in those cases, those specific women that I'm thinking of a year where they are completely infertile. And there's so much education that goes into why their body is continuing to be infertile. It has, as you know, I'm sure you're a breastfeeding mother, it has to do with the fertility or the breastfeeding, the relationship of how a woman is breastfeeding. And so I think one of the best practices for women to learn is what breastfeeding habits help a woman suppress those fertility hormones longer, so that she can have, if she wants, a longer period of infertility while she's breastfeeding. And those habits are hard to do, and we can't really go into it in this podcast, but
yeah, it's there's a lot of things, because I know what you're getting at. It's like opening a 30-minute, an hour, 2-hour long conversation, but
they're not easy habits, and so in a standard American life,
well,
for
just
all
to give
women.
An example, I guess, just because this is obviously not going to give you the in-depth, but I guess, for instance, like the amount of skin-to-skin contact, or how much you're breastfeeding, or if you're breastfeeding 100% versus if you're breastfeeding and using formula. So there's different things that would impact the how long your fertility returns. But again, that's different for every woman. But I guess what I wanted to get across, because this is not an in-depth instruction as to how to chart when breastfeeding, but just to get across that it is possible to chart very accurately and use fertility awareness while breastfeeding. But even an experienced charter may still need to definitely get the in-depth kind of help and support from a fertility awareness educator, because charting when breastfeeding is like you said, it's a lot different than charting, just general charting. Right. And there's so much variation from, you said your cycle could return within a week or a year. And so you need to know what to do on a day-to-day basis, because it always boils down to what you do every single day, so that you know at the end of each day whether or not it's considered to be a fertile day. And it can be done while breastfeeding. Right.
And I think it's important for breastfeeding moms who are tired and exhausted, whether they're experienced charters or just learning how to chart. I think it's important for them to feel like peace, and to feel okay, to know that they're going to have to rely on barrier methods for intercourse more frequently than when they use the method with their typical cycles, when they do return to typical ovulatory cycles. And that's okay, that for an experienced charter, that doesn't mean that a woman's, failing because she has to use a condom a little bit more often as a barrier method. Breastfeeding while using it's just an ambiguous time in a woman's cycle that she can chart, and she can know every day, is today a safe day to have unprotected intercourse or not? And there just happen to be a lot less safe days for a woman who's breastfeeding than a woman who's having her typical ovulatory cycles after she has stopped breastfeeding, or if they've returned while she's breastfeeding. So that's to say, I really don't want those experienced warrior charters out there who might be listening to ever feel like relying on barrier methods a little bit more regularly is bad. There's just less safe days when you're breastfeeding, because there are more days where once your body has started returning to fertility, there's more days where you're potentially fertile, and so you need to behave accordingly and use a barrier method or abstain.
And I think it's safe to say that when it comes to the fertility awareness method, I feel like women learn best and feel most confident when they're surrounded by other women. So when you're having the support of an educator who is experienced and who has learned the method specifically from an organization that teaches it. There's very few of them. But I feel that we're social creatures, and I feel that women learn best within that kind of supportive community environment, because there are questions that come up that can kind of block you. And even if they're straightforward questions, as we talked about earlier, if they're not being answered, it challenges your confidence in the method. Right. And so I guess what I'd love for the listeners to take away from this is that fertility awareness is something that you can use throughout different phases of your life. You can use it even if you have changes in your menstrual cycle, even if your cycle isn't exactly the same every single time, and throughout the different phases of your life. So it's still an effective method while breastfeeding, but the key thing is that it's a really important thing to be able to get support. Reading it from a book gives you a certain level of understanding, but the experience of it is different to what you read in a book. And so it's really helpful to make sure that you're getting the support you need.
Yeah, you said it so well, Lisa.
All right. So coming towards the end of the interview, I'll just wrap up with a couple questions. I like to ask a couple questions in the end. And one of the questions I want to ask, is there any one thing that you think all women should know about the fertility awareness method?
Ooh, one thing. It's not just for having babies or birth control. Mm-hmm. It's for knowing your feminine self in a way that can really rock your world.
Beautifully said. I love that. What would you say is one of the most common myths about fertility or fertility awareness that you would like to see corrected?
Oh, that fertility is not just for having babies. The word fertility, and I ask my students and clients this in every class, what's the first thing you think of when I say fertility? Everyone says babies. And I want the whole world to know that the term fertility is actually so much more than that. It's for women who never want to have children ever, or women who are on birth control and don't care about their fertility. Like, it's for everyone, because a woman's fertility is her vibrance. It's her connection to a greater orchestrated process that's happening in her body. And women who and men who like take time to kind of learn about a woman's fertility are just learning some of the most essential things, I think, of Mother Earth. And so it's beautiful. Fertility is something that everyone should kind of embrace and learn at much younger ages than we do now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that when you sign up for a fertility awareness class, you don't really know what you're getting yourself into, because you think you're just finding a birth control method or just trying to figure out how to help you get pregnant. And you end up finding that it's so much more profound than that. And so it was beautifully stated. So one question I always tend to ask is, for women who are currently on the pill but know they want to have a baby in the next few years, so maybe the next 2 to 3 years, what advice, if any, would you give them? They're not ready to get pregnant now, though, but in the future.
Sure. And they're on the hormonal birth control pill. Mm-hmm. That's going to depend on each woman's and each couple's comfort level. Mm-hmm. So if I had to be most conservative, like my top most conservative recommendation would be to stop the birth control pill right away. And it's conservative because it's definitely something that for our health is the most conservative thing we can do, not necessarily the other way we think, which is whether we're going to have a baby or not. But I would stop right away, and I would rely on barrier methods while taking the time to take a class from a fertility awareness educator to learn how to chart your cycles. Because when you are ready to start having babies, being able to chart your cycles is going to help enhance that process and optimize chances of conception much sooner. And in the meantime, a couple really needs that time, I mean, 2 years, even just 1 year, even just 6 months of stopping birth control before starting to try to get pregnant is so huge for the woman's hormonal cycle. And it's such an important part of being able to prepare the body to conceive, is to get the synthetic hormones out of the body. And so that would be my most favored recommendation. Otherwise, I would recommend that within 12 months of knowing that you want to start trying, to go off of the pill, rebuild those nutrient levels with multivitamins and B vitamins, to help the body and support the liver, to help the body just be able to get the synthetic hormones out. Start taking prenatals. You can take a prenatal a year before you're ready to start trying to conceive. There's so much, and that's one of my primary consultations that I do, is a preconception plan. Mm-hmm. A preconception plan really, really can start 3 years before a couple says, we're going to start trying to have a baby in 3 years, in 2 years, in 1 year. And if we can start thinking like, oh yeah, like my preconception plan can start a whole year before we actually try to get pregnant, mm-hmm. then we're really helping to align male and female fertility up for having the healthiest conception possible.
Oh, such wise words. I love that you said that the preconception plan can start 3 years, 2 years, because that's one of the shifts that I'd love to be a part of, helping to shift that. Because for me, when I got pregnant with my son, I didn't have that consciousness. I didn't even think about, I started taking prenatals and I stopped drinking. Yeah. I wasn't a big drinker or anything, but I would have a glass of wine or whatever with dinner sometimes. So that was basically what I did. And now, I know so much more. And so that's one of the reasons I do this. The preconception is so important, even to just start getting yourself thinking about preparing yourself way before you're even thinking about having a baby.
Yeah. And it's not just the women that need to. It's males and females that can do a preconception plan together to make the male sperm and the female eggs as healthy as possible.
Okay. Well, one more question.
Sure.
For someone who is considering the fertility awareness method, and maybe that's why they tuned in today, but they're afraid to make the leap, what would you say? It's kind of hard to shift your mind when you kind of go on the pill. I always say that we've always been told that we're fertile all the time. We could get pregnant any day. And so it's really hard to shift your consciousness to realize that there's only, as you said, a third of your cycle or a few specific days in your cycle when you can actually conceive.
Right. Well, I would recommend a free 15-minute phone consult with me. I offer those to anyone. You can find them on my website at Red Coral Fertility. You can just schedule them with me. But yeah, I do a free 15-minute conversation with women to answer some of their really huge questions that they have. How do I know this is going to be an accurate form of not getting pregnant? I work with clients who tell me, I absolutely 100% cannot get pregnant or I will kill myself.
No.
who go from that to being some of the best charters of the fertility awareness method that I've ever seen, and successfully avoiding pregnancy month after month because they're using the method correctly. And so for me, I was that skeptic, Lisa, that you just described. So if there's anyone listening and you're feeling that skepticism, you can always do what I did, which is grab a book, learn the basic, read the chapter that just tells you what cervical fluid is, and read the chapter that tells you how to take your temperature, and start putting that information on a chart. It doesn't mean that you absolutely will not be using the method for birth control, but you're going to be experimenting with yourself. Those of you who are listening to this podcast are probably researchers, and you're probably women that really care about doing things the right way. Mm-hmm. So experiment, put the cervical fluid and the waking body temperatures to the test, and see in terms of what your chart will look like after a full cycle and after 2 full cycles, and find out if that makes sense to you, and then take those cycles and bring those to me and do the free 15-minute consult where we can look at those together and see what amazing thing you've done by just checking in with your body and putting it on paper every day. I feel like that is the thing most people can do to go from being skeptical to convinced. I really do.
Amazing. I love that. And so, Justina, how can our listeners get in touch with you for that 15-minute free consultation or just to work with you in general?
Perfect. On my website, redcoralfertility.com, about halfway through, there's a button that says, click here to schedule a 15-minute free consult, and it takes you to a scheduling page. And you can just pick a time, and you'll call me and we'll talk. And that's the main way to contact me. Or if you're out there and you're already an experienced charter, maybe you learn the fertility awareness method through a book and you don't want to take a class. That's totally fine. If you want me to just do a private chart review with you based on what you've learned from the book to just check in and see if you're processing everything as adequately as you can, then let's do that. We can schedule the same way.
Okay. Well, Justina, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I absolutely loved our conversation. You just have such fantastic energy. You're so knowledgeable about the fertility awareness method, and you have such an amazing I just feel that the way that you look at the female body and just the positivity you bring to it and the passion and everything that you infuse into your work has really inspired me today. So I'm really happy with our conversation. It was so much fun.
Thank you, Lisa. That's really, really awesome to hear. And I'm such an advocate for what you're doing with your website, your blog, and your podcast. I think it's huge. The fact that you're sharing information with people, information you wish you knew when you were 19 years old.
Yeah.
And I totally resonate with that mission you have. So I really appreciate you asking me to be a part of it.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks so much. It was a lot of fun.
Have a good one, Lisa. Bye.
You too. Bye. Thanks for listening today. If you enjoyed today's show, please stop by the blog and leave a comment in the show notes for today's episode at fertilityfriday.com/Justina. You'll find all the links to Justina's website as well as how to sign up for the 15-minute free consultation at the Fertility Friday website also. And you can tweet me at Fertile Friday if you have any comments about the show. And you can also find me on the Fertility Friday Facebook page. And that's facebook.com/fertilityfridays. So thanks again for listening. And until next time, be well and happy charting.